What's good, YouTube? It's Justice. I used to be paying. Today I'm back with another video. And in this video, I'm going to be explaining why Drake delivered exactly what you expected him to. But before I get into that, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Do all those things. It helps me out a ton. Drake and PartyNextDoor finally released their long-awaited collab album, Some Sexy Songs for You. And no, that's not me trying to be funny. That's genuinely the name of the project. And it's been released to a mixed review. Just kind of down the middle. You're either hot or cold on this album, at least according to the internet, which, I mean, the internet just kind of puts everything in extremes anyway, but like people are either really loving this project or they're kind of hating it, which kind of seems like that's just how things are going to be for Drake in the near future. You're either completely on Team Drake or you're completely off of it. There's really not a lot of middle ground, at least not at this point. But when it comes to this album, I think it's so interesting because the discourse surrounding it is just so perfect to me, because it's like, it's exactly what the discourse kind of should be. Like, how you feel about this Drake album honestly tells me more about you than it does about Drake. Like, this album is much more a litmus test for how people feel about Drake than it is really telling us anything new or anything kind of different about Drake. And I'm just speaking about how people feel about Drake as an artist, not necessarily a person or anything outside of the music, but setting the parameters at CLB and onwards as modern day Drake. Everything that is modern day Drake is really personified in this album, for better or for worse. When people say stuff that's negative or say stuff that's good, like, it's all in there when it comes to this album representing modern day Drake. Him singing and talking about, not having a lot of friends, people turning their backs on him, stabbing him in the back, not trusting the industry, him talking about his flings with women, not ever being able to tie it down, not finding a good woman, being toxic, and possibly never wanting to get married. The subtle shots at other people throughout his music that aren't really like, direct name shots, but shots at people that we can all pretty much recognize. And then like some of the super just unserious music that Drake likes to put out from time to time. Like, all of that, all of the Drake stereotypes over the last like 5 years or so are in this album. Yet, depending on who you talk to, that either makes this album really bad and one of the worst projects that he's released, or one of the best albums of the year so far, at least. I know it's only February. In my opinion, this album, like, it just kind of exists to me. Like, it's not necessarily bad. There is some good stuff on here, but it's just not what I wanted necessarily. Because if you were to ask me pretty much every year from 2020 up until now what I wanted from Drake, if anything, it would have always been an R&B album. That's always been my answer for what I want to see from Drake this year, from like 2020 onwards. And then, technically this is a collab album with P&D, so it's not just like a full-length Drake R&B album, but this is probably as close as we're gonna get. And again, there's some good stuff on here, but overall, as a whole, I will say this album just kind of disappointed me a little bit in terms of how long I've really waited for an R&B Drake album. Like, there's good songs on here, but there is just a feeling of bloat on this project. Like, a lot of the stuff that's on here just probably doesn't need to be on here. And in return, that kind of makes the album a bit underwhelming, at least to me. I feel like if you were to take off like 4 to 7 songs on here, because there's about 21 songs, if you were to remove like anywhere between 4 to 7 songs, the project immediately becomes way better than it was, just solely off of removing some of those songs. Because I feel like when you're listening to this album, and if you listen to it consecutively, there are some moments where you can kind of get lost in the songs and really not even be able to tell the difference between the song you just listened to and now a new song. Like, sometimes these songs can really start to bleed together. For PartyNextDoor's portion of this album, I thought that he did pretty well. Like, I'm just not that big of a PartyNextDoor fan in general. Even though I love R&B, he just kind of fills the mold. He's actually like low-key the prototype of modern R&B, and that's just really not my favorite style. Like, he makes good music, don't get me wrong, but the whole like super heavy auto-tuned, toxic, melodic, monotone, drug usage R&B, like, it's just not my favorite. I'll listen to it, but it's just not something that I'm really looking for. And even though that's the case, I still think he performed pretty well on a lot of these songs. On some songs, he is the best part, and he has his own songs on here that are pretty decent. But I will say that he didn't really have that big of a portion of this collab. Like, I know it's supposed to be Drake and PartyNextDoor, but it felt like 70% Drake, 30% Party Next Door. Now I'm going to get into like my really personal feelings on this album, like something that maybe you can't necessarily relate to, but throughout the years of listening to Drake, there's just so many different versions of him. You know, there's UK Drake, there's Caribbean Drake, there's Trap Atlanta Drake, there's Trap Memphis Drake. Like, there's so many different versions of the guy. But the two versions that I typically like the most are Timestamp Drake and Loverboy Drake. And when I say Loverboy Drake, I mean like his R&B bag, like Take Care, like Cameras, Good Ones Go, Shot for Me, Over My Dead Body, Marvin's Room, like that type of Loverboy Drake. And he did give us some of that on this album, and those are the songs that I like the most. Like Spider-Man, Superman, that's a song I really like. Crying in Chanel, Raining in Houston, these type of songs. But I feel like we just didn't get enough of that on this album. Like, that's the type of R&B that I really like, especially from Drake. And that's something that I would always give Drake a lot of respect for in his music, is that he wasn't afraid to make that vulnerable R&B music in an era where a lot of people aren't really doing that. And that's why I liked his R&B so much, because in this modern era, you know, everyone's trying to, you know, be Future and be toxic and doing drugs. Like, that's just kind of where we are in the R&B space, for men at least, in this modern era. And Drake was kind of doing some different things from that, and that's why I liked it so much. But in this album in particular, for me, he kind of leans a little bit too much into that like toxic stuff, that Future stuff, for my personal liking. You might not feel that way, but personally, when I'm listening to Drake's R&B music, I'm listening for that yearner, lover boy, I'm singing in the rain type of stuff. That's the type of R&B that is my favorite. When you're singing in the rain for your girl to come back, it may be corny or whatever, and it's not as cool, but that's just what I like personally. And I feel like Drake was missing a little bit more of that than what I would personally prefer. Like, this was just a little bit too modern in terms of like the topics and how he was going about doing the R&B. A common complaint about modern day Drake as well is that he's just like super unserious, and there's two songs in particular that actually prove this point. And it's kind of funny because they're kind of polar opposites in a way, and that's of course Nokia and Meet Your Padre. And I say that they're polar opposites because not necessarily like they're different, but the reactions to them are very different. Because when you listen to a song like Nokia, it's very clearly super unserious. It's just Drake being goofy. It's Drake being, you know, immature. And it's a lot of the stuff that people will point to in his music and be like, bro's 40, still making music like this. Like, you're pushing 40, making these super unserious songs. When are you going to grow up? But Nokia actually works. Like, it's super unserious. It's a funny song, but it's kind of a groovy little bop. Like, it's a fun song. I enjoy it, and most people can enjoy that song. And then on the other hand, we have Meet Your Padre, which is it's so bad. I'm sorry. Like, I know it's Drake not being serious. I know it's not supposed to be taken super seriously, but like, it's just so bad in my opinion. And it's to the point in which it's like, it's so bad that some people are kind of gonna listen to it in like an ironic way. Like, they enjoy it because it's so bad it's good type of thing. And so those two songs both prove the point of Drake being immature or not being super serious in his music, despite him being almost 40. But one really works, and one you can point to and say, if you don't like Nokia, then you probably just like, you don't like fun in your music. Like, you don't like to have a whole bunch of fun when listening to music, which is fine, but you're just a little too serious for me. And then you have Meet Your Padre, where you just kind of look at that song and you run through your mind all the people saying Drake's super immature and he needs to grow up and he's childish, and you're like, they might be right. Overall, I would say the album is okay. Like, you know, there's some good music on here, and then there's a lot of like bleh. In the context of Drake's discography, this is definitely going to be towards the bottom of it, and definitely towards the bottom, or at least a lot weaker than his other collab albums that are actually really, really strong. This one is definitely much, much weaker. The album's probably like a 5.5, 6. Maybe one day it'll rise to a 7. There still is good music on here that I'm going to take with me, but in the bigger picture of Drake's career, this album is just kind of, you know, a blip on the radar. Like, from what I wanted and what I expected from a Drake R&B album, this just didn't really deliver. What this album represents is just whatever you really feel like Drake is at this point. Like, for me personally, This album is okay. It's pretty good. Like modern day Drake still makes some good music. Nowhere near what he was doing at his peak, but still some music that I'll enjoy for sure. He could mature a little bit more in his music, but I just don't see that happening in the near future. But overall, like there's good stuff here, and that's just kind of how I feel about modern day Drake as an artist. If you're a Drake hater, you could take this album and see it as, a nearly 40-year-old man who is still acting like he's 25 and just won't grow up. Even the title of the album is Some Sexy Songs for You, and he's singing and rapping about, his issues with women, his love for strippers, the insecurities that he may have in his relationships and his friendships, and still at the end of the day making some pretty vapid music that people who, listen to Rap Caviar and, maybe TikTok, get their music from TikTok, will enjoy. Music that doesn't have a whole bunch of deeper meaning and is just kind of mindless music to play and get lit to. Like, you see how I was able to paint that picture, and somebody who is standing on that side of the fence legitimately probably feels that way about this album, but that's just how they feel about modern Drake as a whole. If you're a diehard Drake fan that pretty much loves everything that he puts out, then this album is exactly what you've been waiting for post-beef. He finally gave you a full-length project full of music that you can play and turn up in the clubs too. You can play at, little functions at your house or, little kickbacks. You can play in public. You can play with women. He finally gave you some of that music that you were looking for, and he's not depending on beef to, do numbers. He doesn't have to mention anything that happened over the last year, even though he does just a little bit, but he doesn't have to mention all that in order to do numbers. He's just dropping music without any gimmicks, without any, names being mentioned or weird stuff going on. Like, he just gave you great music in your opinion, and that's exactly what you've been looking for. However you feel about Drake was solidified by this album. Like, if you think he's a 40-year-old weirdo trying to be young and never growing up, this album confirms it. If you think Drake is the GOAT and he doesn't need to talk about Kendrick in order to make good music or to have crazy numbers, this album confirms it. If you think Drake is immature and unhappy in his life, coping by partying, drinking, and doing drugs, this album confirms it. If you think Drake is past his prime and will never make the music he once did while dropping a bunch of filler just to do numbers, this album confirms it. If you think Drake has been overhated over the last year and he can still make bangers like a song like Gimme a Hug, this album confirms it. So what this album means to you and how you feel about it is honestly at this point more representative of how you personally feel about modern day Drake as an artist than really anything else that it has to say about Drake. But if you made it this far, I greatly, greatly appreciate you. Make sure you leave a like, comment, subscribe, do all those things. It helps me out a ton. Let me know how you feel about this album and how you feel about modern day Drake in the comment section below. I just don't think that this album necessarily is going to change anybody's ideas on Drake and how they feel about him. Like, if you already really didn't like modern day Drake, you probably don't like this album whatsoever. But if you made it this far, I greatly appreciate you again. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, do all those things. It helps me out a ton. I go by the name of Pay. Peace.